All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, friends, on my radar today is the American dream. Yesterday, we learned that 12 weeks into the coronavirus crisis, millions of Americans are still filing for unemployment. And we're beginning to get an early sense of what the permanent job loss from the economic catastrophe, which was the official policy of our government, is actually going to look like. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell indicated that 2020 was likely to close with unemployment still near 10%, and that the effects of this downturn would linger for years. Of course, the pain has fallen most heavily on those who could least afford it. Many millennials who never recovered their wage losses from the Great Recession watched their jobs vanish overnight. 40% of those making less than $40K per year lost work. And even in the surprisingly not as terrible jobs report that came out last week, while unemployment dropped for many groups, it actually rose for African Americans. America functions on a useful fiction, at least it's useful for some. An imagined fair playing field, an idealized notion that if you work hard and you play by the rules, you too can achieve the family, the house, the stability, and the consumerist trappings of the middle-class life. This is what we're all supposed to want, and it's what we're all supposed to be able to achieve if we're virtuous and marketable in all the prescribed ways. This notion is, in fact, at the very core of the American dream. And this notion has seldom been under more threat from actual observed reality. The government told us all that we needed to stay home to keep our friends and our neighbors safe. In exchange, we were to understand that they would provide enough support for us to financially survive. We, by and large, kept our end of the bargain. They did not. Not for the millions who lost their jobs and their health insurance, by the way. Not for the 40% of small businesses that say they're going to permanently close their doors. Of course, we all know that on the other end of the spectrum, the folks who have lobbyists and fund big campaign donations, they did just fine. The notion of fair play, the idea that your efforts would be commensurate with your success, that if you fail, then you are personally to blame, has never been more of a farce. Believing in the American dream whilst witnessing the utter mockery that the government made out of a level playing field would require a Santa Claus-level delusion. And what's more, no one's under any illusion that the way our society operated during COVID, generous safety nets for the wealthy and food bank struggle and death for the masses, was really fundamentally different from the way that it normally operates. This time it was just on an accelerated timeline, so there was no way to gaslight us into not seeing what was staring us right in the face. For millennials and for Zoomers, none of this comes as any surprise. That's why they back social democracy and the universality of programs like UBI, a federal jobs program, Medicare for all, debt cancellation, and a Green New Deal. In a certain sense, this economics rights agenda is at odds with the baseline concept of the American dream. In the Republican conception of the American dream, all is already functioning just as designed. Racism is a thing of the past. Sexism was never really a thing. And the good ones make it and the bad ones fail, and that's as things should be. The Democratic conception does allow for the possibility of bigotry still standing in the way of the American dream, hence the constant fixation on diversity and representation. If we can just make sure that all the brilliant little Barack Obamas have the path clear to achieve their own American dream, then all will be right and just. Implicit in both of these models is the idea that the market system will appropriately sort out who is worthy and who is not, which is why a universal model of economic rights fits awkwardly with the notion of the American dream. If some are unworthy, then why should we guarantee any economic rights to those lazy freeloaders and welfare queens? I believe the rise of Donald Trump and also of Bernie Sanders and the explosion of people into the streets is part of a reckoning with the fundamental lie of the American dream. It's a recognition that we've been misled, shamed, and forced into constant hopeless struggle by our own elected representatives. And in my view, honestly, the rejection of that happy fairy tale is ultimately a good thing. Why? Well, there's two sides to the American dream. One side is positive. It serves as a cudgel of shame to force our society to reckon with the distance between the romanticized notion and the actual reality. As we've discussed now actually a couple times this week, this idea that ultimately Americans are always swayed by the side advocating equal rights is really critical here. Because how can you imagine that the American dream is available to all when blatant inequalities exist under the law? An appeal to the American dream helped win women's rights and civil rights and gay rights. But an appeal to the American dream did not guarantee those groups economic dignity. The civil rights era integrated the schools, but it didn't guarantee that those schools in poor neighborhoods would be decent quality. The gay rights victory secured the legal right to marry, but did nothing to provide the economic circumstances to make such a right meaningful. Because there's another pernicious side to the American dream fairy tale as well. That side ignores the rapacious cruelty of deriving human worth from market worth. And it ignores the way that corporate power crushes unions and any other semblance of worker power. And it ignores all the many ways that those in the ruling class write the rules of the game such that their own kids inherit their slot in that ruling class. And it says most of all, and this, by the way, is deep in the psyche of our culture, that if you aren't making it, it is your fault, that you should be ashamed. It's why everyone's happy to say Black Lives Matter. But when you say great, that means jobs, it means unions, it means healthcare, suddenly they're nowhere to be found. Justin Guest, for his book, The New Minority, studied the psychological impact of the American dream on the white working class in Youngstown, Ohio. And he found that compared to similarly economically situated Brits, it made them less likely to engage politically, less likely to demand systemic change. And it makes sense. What is there to change and fight for if the problem lies in yourself? Instead, the path forward looks like shame, looks like frustration, looks like a bunch of credit card debt so you can at least try to front the consumerist tokens of that out-of-reach middle-class stability. For many, COVID may have killed their last illusions about the American dream. And frankly, I say, good riddance. And Sagar, this is something that I think has been a long time coming. That book that Justin Guest wrote, by the way,
fantastic.
which did you read it?
Yeah.
It is fantastic. And he talks, this is specifically the white working class that he talks to in Youngstown. And a lot of them still are sort of grappling with the American dream and why it hasn't worked out for them. There's a lot of rationalizations around that and a belief that they're one lucky break away from making it. But even at that time, and this was written, I think, back in 2013, there's a significant number that were saying, no, it's dead. It doesn't work anymore. Maybe for someone else, but it doesn't work for me. It doesn't work here in this town. And I think in particular, that process of sort of exposing the hollowness of it has really accelerated due to the coronavirus crisis and the complete failure of our federal government to respond in anything approaching a fair way.
Yeah, and one of the things I like that you point to is about the thing about choice, is where that people who are in the ruling class will look at people who are in the working class and they'll say it's because of their bad choices that they are where they are.
Right.
But they never apply that same logic to themselves, which is that it's not because of their own choices. It's because they structured the rules and they got political choices and policy choices to be made that made them rich and other people poor. So it's like a choice for thee, but not for me, because
Right.
if they have to acknowledge that these people have spent 70 years trying to make it seem natural that we just ship all of our jobs overseas. They want you to think that's the natural order of the economy.
And that there's no other choice,
Comparative
basically.
advantage, you fools. You want to pay more for a TV? No, of course not. That's the be-all, end-all of our society. They want to make it so that this is the natural state of things. If you are, if you ended up in a bad situation, screw you.
Right.
One of the most pernicious things, this is a libertarian thing. They're always like, why don't these people just get up and move, right? It's like, well, some people like living next to their mom. Some people like living next to their grandmother, or driving past a cemetery where 4 generations of their people have been buried, or being close to their uncles and aunts and taking care of their kids, or having a relative take care of their kids, and they don't want to move into a box-style apartment in the city and just live a soulless life.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that.
That community value is something that's really been devalued across the board. And we see it in the way that, our communities are hollowed out. They're not valued. They're not supported by our government institutions. It's not considered a value that you're sort of looked down on.
They're not even supported. They're trying to gut them.
Right, exactly. They're you're sort of looked down on if that is a value that you affirmatively hold and strive to keep within your life. I think there's also something, I was thinking about this yesterday. If you secure people's basic economic rights, like you have healthcare, you've got, a decent living, you've got all of these things are available to you, and you don't make it, then okay, we can talk about personal responsibility.
Sure.
We can talk about choices. But when you have a system that is so unfair, that is so rigged, that is so brutal and cruel to a majority of the population, then you have no right talking about personal responsibility with anyone. I thought it was really interesting, the research, too, that shows, compared to the British working class, Americans are less likely to politically agitate. Why? Because there is so much poverty shame that is embedded in that notion of the American dream, in the fictionalized notion that if you work hard and play by the rules, you can make it. The flip side of that is if you don't, it is your fault. And so this is internalized not just by the ruling class, it's internalized by everyone. It's internalized by the people who are living and struggling to make it day to day. So when you have a moment like this, where it is so clear
It just gets stripped
that
away.
the people who were put out of work, no fault of their own, that the people who are struggling to make rent right now, who are probably not going to be able to make rent once that unemployment extra $600 plus up ends and the moratorium on evictions and foreclosures ends, like that is so clearly not their fault. It is so clearly a systemic government failure that I really think it exposes the lie here. I also think it's part of why, look, obviously, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and ultimately George Floyd was the spark that drove people into the streets. But I do think that that fundamental sort of breakdown of the conception and the idea or any sort of fictionalized idea that this society is fundamentally fair, I think that is also part of what has created this spark that has spread around the entire country.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think so too. And just the way this whole situation has been handled has been so terrible, and it stripped away the final, because this time they can't even sell you the lie. They can't sell you the lie of, yeah, but you have cheaper stuff now. We shipped your jobs overseas and we gutted your community and we stopped giving you this and that and, cut, cat taxes for some people, etc. But at least you got X. Here, they just took your job away.
Yeah.
And now they're not giving you anything.
Right.
And this is the real lie. And now, they're still not giving you anything.
Very well said. All right, Sagar, looking forward to your radar. That's next.